Hello and welcome to David Starkey Talks. Outside, there are rays of sunshine, believe it or not. In our minds, there is the dawn of Elon Musk, this extraordinary intervention into British politics, which is, well, it's much bigger than Trump, really, isn't it? Although it's a kind of side phenomenon to that. These 2-3 lines that turn our politics upside down on a daily basis. But why on earth is Musk, the richest man in the world, with the American president as his best buddy, the world literally at his feet? Why is he so interested in this little corner of the world called Britain, or perhaps more particularly England? What's the explanation? Because in fact, he is indeed, of course, a chronic tweeter, or Xer, or whatever it's called. But an astonishing proportion of them are devoted to England, to Britain, and to our present plight. Why? Well, lots of people have been asking this question, and in our modern fashion, we've tended to answer it in a pretty reductive, biographical way, or above all, focusing, if you're hostile to him, on self-interest, that it's to protect Twitter or X against regulation, it's to make money, it's to win market share, it's to the wicked control of billionaires of government, of course, rather forgetting that the billionaires like Bill Gates and George Soros on the other side have been interfering in government for, well, very many years. But I don't think that kind of personal reductionism is really the key. Now, there are personal elements, biographical elements in Musk, which I think are important. The first is the general reason for his transition, if I dare use that word, from a fairly middle-of-the-road Democrat, leftish Californian position to where he stands now at the heart of Mar-a-Lago, literally at the right hand of Trump, this very, very heart of the MAGA enterprise. One aspect of it is deeply personal. It is that one of his older children, born a boy called Wilson, transitioned at the age of 16 into a girl called Vivian, and Musk has proclaimed that son is dead to him. And in an extensive interview with Jordan Peterson, he's talked about transitioning as mutilation, as castration, chemical, physical castration, as an appalling abuse of the young body. He is passionate about children, whether he's actually passionate about his own children, but he's certainly passionate about children in general and the need for fertility. And I think we must see, and I think we must acknowledge that terrible sense of loss, and a loss of a child in the most brutal and horrible fashion, because we are beginning to recognize just what transitioning, what the horror of mutilation and the continued artificiality of so-called sexual members that require perpetual dilation. In fact, open wounds, an open wound in the heart of a father as well as in the body of a child. Very clear, I think, why that political shift has followed that sense of personal loss and profound repugnance, which, because Musk is a very passionate man, turns into a genuine hatred. So there's that. There's also, of course, the other question. So that's a general move from left to right, apart from merely growing older and wiser. That's not a word that one would apply very much to Musk with his extraordinary seething passions, that burning sense of doing something fresh, thinking fresh, clearly waking up in the middle of the night, sleeping very little, with a head buzzing with ideas. But the other thing is more sentimental, isn't it? Because I think we've got to see sentiment in this man. He talks frequently of the fact that although he's South African born, he is English South African, not Afrikaans, and he is particularly attached and has made much of, whether it's true or whether it's, we all amend our biographies, our autobiographies, biographies, the constructions, aren't they, of our own life story, and we interpret it according to memory, according to the pressures of the moment, according to our changing selves. The meaning of different episodes in our life changes as our life itself changes. Anyway, the moment, his great sentimental anchor to England is his English grandmother, and he calls her Nana. She's born in Liverpool, and she's called Cora Amelia Robinson, and she marries his grandfather, William Musk, in England at the end of the Second World War. And she was like my mother, who is, I think, a little older, and she makes a living by cleaning houses for other people, and he talks about that with feeling, and there is that sense of a kind of continuity, a genealogical, a family continuity with England. Again, with the Trumps and the Scottish grandmother, there's something very, very similar. There is that sense of an ancestral identity which brings them back, both of them, the one to England, the other to Scotland, to Britain, to the British Isles. And I think that's very important. You have a sense of belonging, however displaced, however much you've been away. But I think these personal factors, the, if you like, the repellent factor, the sense of loss for his son who transitioned to become this person that he didn't recognize, that had repudiated him so vigorously and publicly, that the push, the pull of Nana, of the English grandmother, to the locality, the specificities of England. But I think there's something very, very much bigger, something that's beyond the personal. I think there's something that is fundamentally intellectual and political. And I think we need to recognise it. And above all, I think our government needs to recognise it. Starmer needs to recognise it. Because if he doesn't, he will be chewed up and spat out. The clue, as ever, came from Twitter. A few days ago, this was posted by a man who is an ex DC Washington staffer, is associated with a rather political view of Christianity, of Baptist Christianity, but very much with a political overtone, called William Wolfe. And he wrote this tweet and addressed it to Musk himself, at Musk. I don't think the normies are getting this yet, William Wolfe began. In the UK, the birthplace of Magna Carta, English common law, and the cradle nation of the USA. Let me repeat that. In the United Kingdom, the birthplace of Magna Carta, English common law, and the cradle nation of the USA. If you are a white English-born citizen, you'll be sent to jail for posting unapproved opinions on social media. But if you're Pakistani and rape young girls, the authorities will help cover it up. Musk responded, and the tweet got millions and millions of views. Musk responded, true, it hasn't quite sunk in yet, but it will. Now, what's that about? Well, it's about several things. It's about a view of Britain and a view of America which has been able to remain true to its identity, and of a Britain that has betrayed it, that has fallen. Let's sort out first the view of America that this represents. There are two very different views of the American Revolution. One is that it represents the foundation of a state on new principles, the idea of human rights, the ideas espoused by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, which talks about human rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this idea of a novel formation of a state based on human rights. It's an idea which is picked up by Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address and enormously developed from the Great Society of 1968 onwards and so on. This idea of the rights, the novelty, the singularity, the difference of America, the thing that connects it with the French Revolution, this great turning point in time. But there is a very different view of what happened in America, because despite all these Lockean ideas about human rights and the rights of the citizen to overthrow the government if these rights are not fulfilled, the Constitution itself, which is after all the document that actually governs America, the Declaration, is simply a piece of rhetoric to justify what they were doing. In the Constitution, well, there isn't any reference to this sort of thing at all. In other words, far from being a revolutionary document, the Constitution is a very conservative document. It keeps the essential lineaments of how they were governed already. The colonies, of course, already had representative assemblies because it imitated England. They had governors representing the king and acting exactly as they do now as the executives of each colony. And when the colonies came together to decide how they were going to be governed in that great Congress at Philadelphia, what they eventually come up with is a structure of government which is astonishingly like government in Britain in the 18th century. I've talked about this a lot before. If you go to Congress, you are very struck. There are two chambers. The Senate, clearly, is the House of Lords in quasi-democratic dress, though not very much. If you go over to the House of Representatives, well, it is the House. It's presided over by a speaker. Its administrative officer is, as I constantly point out, the Sergeant at Arms, because the Sergeant at Arms is the administrative officer of the House of Commons. The relationship between the two houses, the practice of bills, the oddities like impeachment and so on, they're all completely derived from the English, the Anglo-British, we better call it, constitution of the late 18th century. And much more than that. Of course, what remained the same too was, well, let's just look at that. In other words, the Constitution is, if we go to that formula here, in the UK, the birthplace of Magna Carta, English common law, and the cradle nation of the United States, we've now established that indeed the Constitution, despite all the talk of the break with Britain and the aggression, the denunciation of the very untyrannical George III as tyrant in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution indeed recognises that descent from Britain. But still more, of course, are the other things that are mentioned there. The birthplace of Magna Carta, the idea of limited government, the idea of representative government, government that in some way answers to its people. All of that taken from Britain, but above all, what is taken, what is not changed at all by the American Revolution is the law, is English common law. And what is very little changed too, apart from the fact you kick the Tories out and confiscate their property, are the property rights. So the American Revolution, completely unlike the French Revolution, does not change the fundamentals of that society and makes no attempt to. In other words, it really is a successor state of Britain in the same way that 18th century Britain, in the same way that Canada is a successor nation of 19th century Britain, of Australia as very late 19th, early 20th century Britain, and so on and so on. They are successor states, and America is the first of those successor states. Now, this is, I think, very important. It means that with many Americans, there is a sense of looking to Britain as a kind of model, as something to be seen with respect. The cradle notion, the mother country, and so on. A sense of respect, an awareness that the foundations were laid here. The foundations that have made America great, MAGA. In other words, they inherit from Britain, Anglo-Britain, 18th century Britain, those three crucial things: a known system of law, limited representative government, and secure property right, the things that make America great. And these are, of course, the bases of, it is now absolutely clear and generally reckoned, these are the basic elements which are responsible for economic growth. This is why the Britain of the 17th and the 18th century suddenly leaps ahead in terms of prosperity, leaps ahead in terms of intellectual life, leaps ahead in terms of industry, leaps ahead in terms of power and world dominance. As I constantly say, 17th, 18th century Britain after the Glorious Revolution and let's go back, after the Restoration, the Glorious Revolution, and the establishment of the office of Prime Minister, again, that trinity of things that stabilize our politics and enable those historic advantages of common law, of secure property right, of limited government, actually to work and to work properly. Britain in that period, quite simply, invents the modern world. And our American cousins know that. Musk knows that. He is a great inventor. What he is wanting to do is to reinvent the world that we're in, but he acknowledges what America has enabled him to do and what behind America, the ancestral power of England and Britain. And I think this is what we've really got to understand. The extraordinary explosion, so-called Silicon Valley explosion, the extraordinary explosion of computing and tech, the great pioneers, the great masters, the new masters of the universe, Thiel in particular, Peter Thiel, and Elon Musk himself in particular, recognize that this Anglosphere element, the things derived from England, the common law, the security of property right, representative and limited government, they have been the keys, along with one other thing. They are the keys of political and of commercial and intellectual freedom. But the biggest freedom of all, and the point at which America does diverge from England, is that extraordinary, not actually in the Constitution directly, but in the First Amendment to the Constitution, the beginning of the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, which emphasizes so absolutely and clearly the most fundamental freedom of all, the freedom of speech. And it's worth looking, which is the freedom of ideas. It's the freedom of the mind. It's the freedom which creates, which can challenge, which can overturn, which can take history and turn it into a fertile soil from which new things grow. That wonderful Chaucerian phrase that I go back to so often. Just as from the old earth each year comes the new corn, so from old new science springs. It's that mental freedom which acts as the fertilizer to the earth and enables that astonishing process of continuous change and development to happen. That process of constant change, but within limits, within a framework, which is the unique feature of this Anglo-British American civilization as it's developed from the 16th, 17th centuries onwards. But the key, the point at which I think America genuinely innovates, isn't the talk of general human rights. It's this very negative right, because the First Amendment is a highly negative statement. It doesn't say what you can do, it says what the state can't do. It's negative liberty. And it really is worth just listening to it fully. The First Amendment, then. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for the redress of grievances. In other words, you don't limit the activity of the mind or of the body any more than you absolutely have to. And that, I think, is where Silicon Valley comes in. It is just the same way that Isaac Newton, Locke, the extraordinary creativity of late 70s establishment of the Bank of England, the extraordinary expansion of British power, of the armies of Marlborough, of the navies as they flow into through the 18th century. To Nelson, of the vast expansion of the British Empire, particularly in America in the middle of the 18th century with the 7 Years' War. All of those freedoms are embodied in that idea of the freedom of the mind, of the freedom of speech, of the freedom of communication, which produces that great late 17th century explosion of the mind. And also, the titans of Silicon Valley produced this new third or fourth industrial and intellectual and every other sort of revolution, which is embodied in the world of the computer, electronics, everything that I am using as I make this program. That's what Musk understands. That's what Thiel understands. That is what those titans understand. And they understand something else. They understand where it came from, but they are profoundly aware of what has gone wrong. They're aware that because we in Britain did not have that First Amendment, and because we have pursued, since 1968 and the Race Relations Act, we have pursued a policy of the deliberate suppression of speech in the name of racial harmony. That is what has happened. These are the terrible consequences. This is why, of course, Musk has become involved so powerfully in the whole debate over the Pakistani rape gangs, because quite simply, the reason we didn't talk about them was because we've been told it might damage race relations. Now, fine. So, yes, we've fallen, we've sinned, and we've, of course, reaped the consequences, the astonishing tensions in our society, the very existence of the gangs, the taking over of entire areas of our country. Those, we've talked about them before, haven't we? Community policing, in which the police have to consult with local imams and community leaders as to what they really ought to do, and the sense that some people with different colour skins have got community leaders, and on the whole, white people don't. The whole business of two-tier policing. Well, yes, terribly sad, I suppose, but why does Musk get particularly excited about it beyond the sentimentality, beyond the sense that, as he said, his English nana, if she'd been alive now, the social class that she came from, she might have been one of those abused girls. But I think, you see, there's something else. And this goes to where it becomes really political. Because America nearly went the way of Britain. Remember, the whole business of critical race theory, the notions of hate speech itself, Black Lives Matter, the whole business of the absurd overreaction to the death of the drug-addled George Floyd and whatever, all of that comes from America. But why didn't the fact that critical race theory comes from there, that diversity, equality and inclusion is an American invention, the fact, obviously, that Black Lives Matter is, and so on. Why didn't it have quite the same effect there as it's done here? Well, the answer is that First Amendment, which stood in the way of the kind of censorship what's happened in Britain. Because it's quite clear now, the only way you can set up the model of racial harmony being the supreme political good, you can only make it work by censorship. Because that idea of multicultural harmony, well, it would be lovely, wouldn't it? It's a noble idea. Can we just look at that word noble again? Well, the word was actually used. It was used by Tom Holland in a tweet that he's now got an awful lot of problems with, in which he said, wasn't it terrible that the reports of the, it's quite some time ago, wasn't it terrible that the reports of the terrible things that were done to these poor girls had been suppressed, but at least the aim of racial harmony was a noble one. Well, it's a noble one that depends on lies, that depends on the permanent suppression of truth, which is why it needs censorship, why it explicitly needs censorship. People have to be stopped from saying things. It's why we have non-crime hate incidents. It's why we have the severity of punishment for inciting or stirring up racial hatred and so on. It demands state intervention of the most draconian kind. Why doesn't that happen in America? Well, it can't because of the First Amendment. And what is clear, if Kamala Harris had won, the First Amendment would have fallen in America. The signs were absolutely clear. There'd been mounting pressure for the last 10, 20 years, cumulative attack on the idea of the First Amendment's articles appearing, and of course books by the authors, by people heavily invested in critical race theory. Very interesting shifts. In 1997, Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanik republished their 1997 book, Must We Defend Nazis, Hate Speech, Pornography, and the New First Amendment, and it's modified. And the title now becomes Why the First Amendment Should Not Protect Hate Speech and White Supremacy. That same year, there was an argument in the Yale Law Review Journal, sorry, let's get this right, the Yale Law Journal Forum, that when it came to race, the marketplace of ideas does not apply. When ideas on race that would disrupt the racial hierarchy of white over black emerge, the First Amendment is disproportionately applied to trample that dissent. In other words, the First Amendment gets in the way of good race relations. But by 2018, it's actually, the attack becomes totally direct. A book is published called, interestingly enough, The Cult of the Constitution. It's written by the legal scholar Marianne Franks, and it takes aim against First Amendment fundamentalism, the attack on the cult of free speech. Free speech now becomes a cult. It is an obsession which gets in the way of social improvement, of racial harmony, of the appropriate reversal of the relationship between white and black, in which the white goes down and the black comes up. And of course, these are academic things, are academic formulations. They're legalistic formulations, but it starts to enter into the politics, and it becomes ever clearer as the teens of this century go into the 20s, that the Democrats are determined to do everything they can to repeal, amend that First Amendment. there are bellwethers. Needless to say, it is John Kerry speaking at the World Economic Forum on the whole question of, again, that word, disinformation. Kerry said the World Economic Forum, Davos, the thing that Keir Starmer is so fond of. The First Amendment stands as a major block to be able, just, hammer disinformation out of existence. The First Amendment isn't noble. The First Amendment isn't the rock on which America is built. It's just a major block to further improvement of race relations. And it becomes absolutely explicit in one of the presidential debates, actually the vice presidential debate, where Tim Walz, with the whirling arms, says, and it's the moment goes so quickly. And by the way, this is Andrew Doyle who's researched all this, the wonderful comedian and the creator of Titania McGrath. He points out that this moment comes so quickly that it's barely recorded in the transcript, in which Musk, that's to say, Kamala Harris's vice presidential candidate, debating with J.D. Vance, says quite simply, hate speech is not protected by the First Amendment. In other words, why, why Musk suddenly, and remember it's very, very recent, why Musk throws his weight directly behind Trump, why he acquires Twitter, is his fear that that First Amendment, that right to freedom of speech, was about to be suppressed, not simply in Britain, but to be suppressed in America. And I think this is the key. It's the key, clearly, to his purchase of Twitter. Now, I'm going to be talking about the role Twitter played pre-Musk and post-Musk. It's a bit like two eras, BC and AD, before Musk and after Musk. Before Musk, and it's really important we understand this, Twitter was the principal instrument of censorship. It was the principal means through things like cancellation, I know, because I was cancelled via Twitter, by which the code of omerta, of silence on the problems of race, was brutally enforced by the destruction of reputation, the destruction of career, the destruction of social standing. I've always said if they could burn people alive whom they classed as heretics, they would have been burned alive. I would have been burned alive. That's pre-Musk. That moment when Musk has bought Twitter and walks into the headquarters with his kitchen sink, that's the moment when it changes. It is a second coming, because at that point, sacking all the moderators, stripping out the staff, which had been the enforcers of censorship. Moderation means censorship. What Musk did, he stood Twitter on its head. X now became exactly what he'd said it should be, the free marketplace of ideas, and it became the bastion of free speech fundamentalism. So that is the key instrument, this extraordinary transformation, this inversion of the role of Twitter with Musk's purchase of it, and that in turn plays an enormous part in Donald Trump's victory. Because remember, what had happened was precisely Trump had been the first, not the first, but the most notable victim of the policy of censorship. He had been removed from Twitter. Trump is now backed by Musk, and not simply backed by Musk in words, though the whole machinery, indeed, of Twitter is turned behind him, but backed by prodigious sums of money. Is it 250 million? But remember, that's more or less 5 days' earnings for Musk. Nevertheless, it transformed Trump's campaign, which was brilliantly effective in the social media. So Trump wins, and the threat to the First Amendment departs. with the crushing defeat of the Waltzes, of the Harrises, of the Kerrys, and of all the rest of them behind them. That's the victory in America. But in Britain, it's completely the opposite. Okay, he has liberated Twitter, but what had happened in Britain, and this again is, I think, the absolute key to his focus on it, is what he'd feared happening in America. America is the origin of woke. That's where it all comes from. But the place where it's been most effectively enforced, I would argue, is in Britain. This is because in Britain, unlike America, the machinery of law has been turned into the principal support of woke. That's exactly what has happened. That was what, of course, all those opponents of the free marketplace of ideas or free speech fundamentalism, why we should have a hate law in America, that's what they were trying to do there. That's why they were defeated by Trump's victory, propelled by Musk himself. Here, however, they have won. They have won, and I've discussed this extensively, because the entire machinery of state as it's developed, in particular from 1997, but even before, from 1968, with the Race Relations Act, has been designed to sell this idea, not simply to sell, oh dear, selling implies that there's a buyer who's willing to buy, to impose, and to impose by the machinery of the law, as harshly and as rigorously as necessary, to silence people, to impose this idea of the noble, what I call the noble lie of harmonious race relations. And there's one figure who represents it more than anybody else, because the machinery through which it's done, well, it's the Race Relations Act, which right back in 1968, Enoch Powell understood perfectly. If you protect one group, in this case, the blacks, you empower them against the rest, the whites. And that process has continued. So you replace, arguably, one form of superiority by another. You remove any idea of freedom before, any idea of equality before the law. And from 1997, that has been built in, that has been baked in to the new Blairite Constitution. It's been baked in two particular ways. It's been baked in primarily through the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights into British law. And that incorporation, again, I've explained this before, it sounds so wonderful. Human rights, aren't they lovely? But the principal proponent of this, the man who really engineers its, I don't mean Jack Straw, who handles the legislation, but the man who handles the process of intellectual incorporation, Tom Bingham, Lord Justice Bingham, he does something much more striking. He actually says, he lets the cat out of the bag. Indeed, he boasts about it. He says that human rights, in print, explicitly, there, in bold, human rights are anti-democratic or a-democratic because they favour the minority above the majority. So we have written into our law two-tier. And we've written it in other ways, because the Equality Act, by creating a whole series of other protected characteristics beyond race and so on, further enforces the inequality before the law. This strange paradox that a doctrine of rights deprives people of rights, that a doctrine of equality imposes inequality. And then all sorts of new instruments, the most important of which in Britain is the non-crime hate incident, the NCHI, invented, imposed, created under, of all people, Theresa May, a Conservative Prime Minister. But all of this, all of it is incorporated in one individual. Because what again is striking in Musk's critique of Britain is his profound hatred, I'm going to use that word, for a person that I share a hatred too for. I've already said the extent to which I think Starmer is a contemptible individual, a man who fundamentally hates freedom, who can't handle it, who's got a mind so rigid and mechanical that he can't even begin to understand the meaning of it. Well, Musk shares my view, because it is Starmer, that human rights lawyer, who incorporates this entire complex of ideas, the ideas that law, which should be the vehicle of freedom, freedom combined with responsibility, of course, which is turned instead into that wonderful phrase in George Orwell of the boot on the human face forever. That's what Starmer is. And it's not simply in human rights law. It's not simply in the suppression of freedom of speech. Starmer, of course, has another great commitment, this notion of the rule of law, which incorporates discrimination in favour of minorities, also, of course, obliterates the distinction between the native and the foreigner, and it actually gives priority to the foreigner, and it incorporates this absurd notion of international law, something else which Starmer and his sidekick, Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, are particularly keen on. Preposterous. And it's worse than that, isn't it, of course? Because the Americans made perfectly clear what their view of international law is, and particularly international law of another kind that's embodied in the International Criminal Court. International Criminal Court, of course, which has got as its chief prosecutor the British, I was going to call him English, I'd better, the British chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, who has decided that there is a prima facie case for genocide against the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And what has America done? It has decided, at least so far, the legislative process isn't complete, but the House of Representatives has passed a bill which would sanction the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and its chief prosecutor, in particular, Karim Khan. In other words, the institutions before which Britain bows, takes the knee. Do you remember Starmer taking the knee so enthusiastically after Black Lives Matter? Well, he takes the knee exactly to all those international institutions, as does our preposterous Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. That, too, is in the sights of America. They don't want it. They don't like it. I really think everybody's talked about the threat to Starmer from Musk. I don't think either Starmer or the Labour Party fully understand what is going to happen from midday on the 20th of January, when Donald Trump has taken that oath on the Bible and becomes president for the second time. Every single thing that Starmer believes in, backs, has tried to impose on Britain, is hated by Musk. And Musk, I think, has the power, and Starmer doesn't.